Hi, I'm Sarah Hartman, moderator for Ecole Chocolat Hangout. Today we're talking about cocoa butter and the role it plays in creating chocolate flavors and textures. I want to welcome to this discussion our guest chocolate maker Carlos Eichenberger from Danta Chocolate and our guest chocolatier Richard Tango-Lowy from Dancing Lion Chocolate. So Carlos, we know that cocoa beans naturally contain somewhere around 50% cocoa butter. You source your cocoa beans exclusively from Guatemala. Can you tell us a little bit about those beans and their natural cocoa butter percentage?
Certainly. Well, I work with, at the moment, three different plantations. And so each one has their own genetics and therefore a very different cacao. I work with the main supplier for my cacao is named Finca Los Ujustes in the southern part of Guatemala, in the Pacific coast. And they are mostly Trinitario, and they're a very, very old plantation, about 40 years old at least. And their cacao is very nice. It's extremely complex, and it has around 55% cocoa butter, so it's a very high percentage bean. And so it makes the cocoa mass, the cocoa liquor that comes from it, is extremely fluid, and it's very easy to work with. I work with two other plantations at the moment. One of them is called La Soledad, Finca La Soledad, and it's also in the southern part of Guatemala. And they have a more a higher criollo percentage in their genetics. And they claim that it's a pure criollo, but I don't believe them, and they haven't agreed to genetic testing, and I guess that's a good indicator that it's not a pure criollo, but it's still a delicious, delicious cocoa. This is also around the 54 to 55% cocoa butter range, and just recently I started working with a wonderful new plantation. It's called Finca San Juan. Funnily enough, it belongs to the brother of a business partner of mine, and he is very, very interested in looking for the very old heirloom cacaos and reproducing them in his plantation. So far, he's done a very good job. I've had the first samples from him just recently of some larger lots that they've started producing. And interestingly enough, this is the lowest percentage of all the beans that we have, at around 50%. And so, accordingly, when you process it, it actually feels different. You know, it feels more viscous, and it's a little bit more difficult to work with.
And do you blend the beans for your chocolates, or do you make different chocolates based on cocoa beans from a specific farm or region?
Both, yes, I actually do both. I don't do a lot of blends. I actually only do two blends. I do one blend which is exclusive for my friend Rich here, and it's the Ticao milk chocolate, and it's a blend of Los Ujustes and La Soledad. And I also make a blend for myself, and this is a couverture that I make, and it's a blend of all three farms that I work with. This last batch that we made, and so it's the only two blends that we actually do. All the rest of our products are single plantation bars and percentages.
Okay. And do you also take the extra step of pressing your cocoa butter from some of your cocoa beans, and which not many chocolate makers do? Can you tell us a little bit about this process and why you decided to press your own cocoa butter?
Great. Yes, it's a great story. I've always thought that you need to have a specific flavor profile to match your chocolate. In other words, you can't use a cocoa butter from a different plantation and still keep it true to that plantation, because that cocoa butter will have a different flavor from the chocolate that you want to produce. So I decided to, yes, take that extra step and press the butters from each plantation individually. What does this serve? What purpose does it serve? Well, many purposes. Uh, First of all, for making the origin chocolates. In other words, we will make uh, different types of chocolate from each origin, and for that chocolate, which is eating chocolate, we will use that butter. That includes all of our percentages of dark chocolate, milk chocolate, and white chocolate. And why do we use this very strong flavored butter for the white chocolate? Because of the strong flavor. It's because it's just so tasty and so aromatic that it makes a fantastic white chocolate. I think Rich can attest to that one. It's very, very different from any commercial chocolate that you'll try in that it's so rich and aromatic in flavor and aroma. But definitely now we use a very small commercial press to press the cocoa mass. It was made in Korea. It presses one cake at a time, which is very rare. You know, most commercial cocoa butter presses will press up to a dozen cakes at a time, and they can't stop. They have to run 24/7. This is a very different thing. It's a small press. It takes probably an hour to press a full cake, and it'll leave a very high percentage of fat in the cocoa cake still, because it's not a giant industrial press. That will actually make a delicious cocoa powder. It's about 24% fat, which is about the highest fat cocoa powder that you will find from a commercial producer, and it's actually a very good thing.
So is that what we do with the cocoa paste that's left over from the process? We turn it into cocoa powder?
Yes, we actually the cocoa cake gets ground into cocoa powder. Yes, we don't use all of it. We keep some of it and grind it ourselves, and then we sell the rest of it to a local chocolate producer in Antigua, Guatemala. They have been buying it from us for a long time, and it's much easier for us to sell it to them than to grind it into cocoa powder and try and sell it ourselves. We keep a little bit of it, and we do sell it at our shop, and we use it for a lot of. We have a shop, a chocolate shop, and so we actually use it for our pastries and all the things that require cocoa powder. Of course, we use our own in-house cocoa powder.
Mm-hmm. And how do you use the cocoa butter that you press from your beans?
Well, the cocoa butter that we press from the beans, we use for our dark chocolates. We make several percentages of dark chocolate from 82, 75, 70%. The 70% is the one percentage that we have that does not have added cocoa butter. And of course, we will go into this a little later. And then we make a 60%, which is the most accessible to the Guatemalan market because they're not really used to high percentage products. And also a milk chocolate is used because milk chocolate has a very, very high cocoa butter percentage. And finally, we use it for our white chocolates. At the moment, we're still doing plantation specific, and we're doing a blend of white chocolate as well. So you can actually use blended butters to make a different flavor profile for your white chocolate as well.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there you go.
I would like to point out.
I got very impressed with that. I haven't heard of mixing cocoa butter for white chocolate, so that must be very interesting.
Can I jump in a second, sir?
Yeah, of course.
I would like to say, yeah, Carlos's white chocolate is pretty unusual because of the non-deodorized, well, plantation cocoa butters. We've converted a lot of dark chocolate lovers into white chocolate fanatics because you cannot put this stuff in your mouth and say this isn't chocolate. Your brain goes into sort of chocolate overdrive because all the fragrances is there and all the character is there. And the flavor is so deep and complex. You actually taste the same complexity you taste in the, say, Las Ajustes beans. So the white chocolate is just, it's something entirely different than most people have experienced. And we use some other really beautiful whites, but they're not the same beast. And I wanted to ask Carlos, do you think that the expense and the difficulty of pressing is potentially why many of the modern craft chocolate makers won't add cocoa butter? Because if you go to a commercial cocoa butter, you're right, you're bringing a different flavor profile or something kind of alien into your chocolate. Whereas if you're using butter from the same plantation, you're really not changing anything. You're just changing the fluidity. Do you think that's why a lot of people may not be going to adding cocoa butter, or why that's sort of a trend?
It may be a possibility, and probably a few feel that way. But again, it's very expensive to buy the equipment, and it's just very difficult to find as well. So you have to either make it yourself or go on this tremendous quest to find the correct equipment. I was talking with Vincent Muru of Maruta Chocolate, and that has been their main problem. They want to press their own butter, but they haven't been able to get a proper press. And so that's been one of their main obstacles. And for example, the Korean company that made the press that we use is no longer in business. It really is a difficult thing for craft chocolate makers to actually be able to do this. It's not that simple. I was very lucky to find this press, and also I'm very lucky to actually be in a cacao producing country, because I can use the same beans that are being used for the chocolate to press the butter from, and be confident that it's the same quality. You have to remember that most of the beans that are used for pressing commercial butter are second or even third quality beans. So there's a lot of different considerations for craft chocolate makers to not use butter in their chocolate because they can't press their own. But I also feel that it's a philosophical thing as well. They're trying to put forth their own personal view on how a craft chocolate should be made. And so it becomes, a matter of personality more than anything else, if you ask me.
Can I just go back a little bit, just so we explain to the viewers, maybe the difference between a deodorized cocoa butter and a non-deodorized cocoa butter?
Certainly. A deodorized cocoa butter has gone through an industrial process to strip away all of the aroma and flavor that it may still retain from the cacao. A natural butter has not gone through any process. Sometimes they're filtered, but that's about as much as you will process a natural butter. Instead, a deodorized cocoa butter can go through different processes. One of the deodorization processes is steam, and there are also chemical processes to strip the flavor and aroma from it. So it's definitely an industrial product.
And it makes for a more neutral product as well.
It makes for a totally neutral product. There's almost no aroma or flavor left in it. And it can be used for an enormous range of different applications aside from chocolate making. It's used in the food business a lot, and it's used in the cosmetics industry a lot because of that lack of aroma and flavor.
Mm-hmm. And Carlos, what has been some of the reactions from your customers to the higher cocoa butter percentage chocolates that you produce as compared to lower cocoa butter percentage chocolates that you make as well?
Well, our bars sell about equally, so it's pretty difficult to gauge, at least sales-wise, how they're opining about this. However, in the more connoisseur group in our customer base, They are more inclined for the higher percentage chocolates, but they still like the smoothness of the added cocoa butter. But this is locally in Guatemala. My European customers much, much, much prefer the chocolate that doesn't have any added cocoa butter.
Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely a matter of national tastes and regional tastes, and it probably boils down to local tastes as well. But in my case, that is the experience I have. I really haven't been able to gauge the American market, but my European customers, I was at two different shows recently in March and April, and we did a lot of sampling. I broke up at least 250 bars to sample, and definitely the reaction and the preference was clearly towards the chocolate that did not have any butter added to it.
Now, is that customer a chocolatier or a retail customer?
No, these were consumer shows. So
Okay.
it was definitely the consumer that was giving us that feedback. We had at one in one of the events we had a professional day, and again, well, there the reactions were more mixed because you know each chocolate also had its purpose. So it was more. We didn't really have a preference. It was just an opinion of each of the chocolates separately.
Now, Rich, let me turn to you a little bit. As a chocolatier and someone who works closely with chocolate makers like Carlos himself, to source the chocolate that you're going to use for your confections, your bonbons, your bars, do you source low or high cocoa butter percentage chocolate?
I actually keep about 20 different kinds of chocolate in our shop that we work with, and I source both and across the board for different reasons. I find that I'm very, you know, at our shop we've done a hangout or two before, and we're particularly focused on flavor and flavor development in chocolate. And so when I work with a chocolate, I pay a lot of attention to how a flavor opens up, how it works, so I know how I want to work with that chocolate. And low cocoa butter and high cocoa butter chocolates behave very, very, very differently. So for instance, if I take a low cocoa butter, a Madagascar is a very good example because it's got such a big, bright flavor typically. If I take a Madagascar from a good craft chocolate maker with very low cocoa butter in it, what I'm going to get is just an immediate explosion of bright flavor, and then it's going to sort of even out. If I take a Madagascar from a chocolate maker who tends to a little more cocoa butter, what I'm going to get is a very clean flavor that extends over a greater time. And there's some chemical reasons for that we can talk about a little bit later if you'd like. But so it gives me two different things to work with. And I think a lot of people like that initial explosion, but it's a very different thing. I mean, I tend to have a little bit of preference very often for the cleaner, longer flavors because it gives me as a chocolatier the opportunity to pull out flavors at different times. And an example also is Carlos's chocolate, the 70%, which tends to taste dark, and it tastes kind of big and earthy. But when you go down to the 60% with the added cocoa butter, what you tend to get is layers of flavor that just keep coming. And you can taste, it starts to unravel, and you can taste all the different pieces. Where in the 70%, you don't really get that. You get the big. I often tend to like to be able to pull out those pieces. As a chocolatier, you know, if I want a particular earthiness or a particular fruitiness or the honey notes in it, I can do things that pull those flavors out at the time they would usually come out once it's stretched out. So we'll use both for different things.
Okay. So you both have used the word couverture, which is a term used in the industry to denote the fluidity in the chocolate, or more fluidity in the chocolate. And why is fluidity so important to a chocolatier?
It goes like this. If I am making a ganache, you know, cream chocolate emulsion, the fluidity is not terribly important. I can accommodate for it. And I can pick chocolate with a lot of fluidity or a lot of cocoa butter or very little cocoa butter. If I am molding a piece or putting a paper-thin layer of chocolate on a truffle or something like that, I really want chocolate that is very fluid and easy to work with. I can control exactly the thickness of that shell. I have a lot more control about what's going on. So the fluidity really plays into how we work with a particular chocolate, whether it's sort of like working like with mortar, which is very thick, or whether it's almost like working like with water. And they're very different experiences.
So the property of the chocolate plays a pretty big part in your choosing of a particular chocolate when you're developing a recipe.
Often I'll go where we need to go. So if I'm making a bonbon and I think that the shell of that bonbon is a particular chocolate that just happens to be low cocoa butter and very high viscosity, has very little fluidity, we'll do that. And it's much more difficult to do that. But we'll do it anyway because it's the right thing. What hits your tongue first leads into what's going to happen with the bonbon. We're a little different. I'll use any chocolate for the outside shell of a truffle, depending upon the flavor and the character I want for the piece I'm making. So we don't always just use couverture chocolates for couverture things, but it makes it a lot easier. And so most chocolatiers, yeah, if they're going to be molding, they want a couverture chocolate. It's fluid, it's easy to work with. Yeah, they don't want to have to fight with it.
Now, Carlos, I'm going to go back a little bit to what you were talking about, this new philosophy with the craft chocolate makers. So we know that the larger chocolate makers, chocolate producers, make different chocolates with varying percentages of cocoa butter. And now we also have the craft chocolate makers who feel that adding extra cocoa butter on top of whatever amount of cocoa is already in the chocolate is going to dilute the flavor of that cocoa. So they prefer to keep it to a minimum within the cocoa range. And can you talk a little bit more about your opinion on that philosophy?
Sure. Well, I don't necessarily agree with it because, as we've discussed earlier, the cocoa butter definitely has its uses, and if you are pressing plantation-specific butter, it will certainly not dilute the flavor. It'll probably enhance it because, as we've spoken before, the fat is the main flavor carrier, and if this fat already has a degree of aroma and flavor to it, it will not take away from the original flavor of the beans. However, what it will do, as Rich so eloquently put before, it will completely change the dynamics of the way this chocolate melts in your mouth. And that will absolutely make an enormous difference. But, you know, it probably goes down to the difficulty of pressing your own butter, difficulty and expense, because, again, it's very, very expensive, and that's why I only use it in my eating chocolates and not in the couvertures, for example. But, you know, and as I said before, it boils down to completely a thing of personality, how you personally as a chocolate maker feel about it. You know, if they don't have the access to the butters that they're making the chocolate from, I think it's just as well that they don't use added cocoa butter, because then they would be changing the flavor profile of their chocolate. And if they use deodorized cocoa butter, which is something that some people do, actually, if they don't want to mess with the flavor profile of the chocolate, it will actually change the mouthfeel and the melting properties of the chocolate, and the crystallization properties as well, because it's a different cocoa butter. It won't have the same crystallization properties as the original beans. So, you know, I don't blame them for not using it. It's just a personal thing. And also, again, it's a problem that they have, that they don't have the access to that particular specific cocoa butter that they need. So it becomes much simpler to just not use it.
On the other hand, if I may continue on that, because I do like working with both styles of chocolate. On the other hand, there are two things when you think about cocoa butter that are really important. One is that fat is a flavor carrier, as Carlos mentioned. If you have no fat, you don't really have mouthfeel and flavor. The second part is that I used to be a physicist. as we know in the industry, cocoa butter is a six-phase polymorphic crystal. It forms a very robust crystalline structure, and it takes energy to break that down. So if you temper chocolate well, that cocoa butter locks the flavor into the chocolate. And as you put that chocolate in your mouth and you're starting to break that crystalline matrix through heat and chewing and putting energy into it, it's slowly releasing aspects of that chocolate. And so the mouthfeel, as Carlos mentioned, is very, very different. Because it's slowly releasing the aspects of that chocolate, the cocoa butter allows it to flow through your mouth and distribute the flavor of the chocolate. The chocolate isn't only, in a lot of ways, more complex, but it also tastes less dark, meaning I can have say 60% cocoa solids and then have some cocoa butter and one with a little bit less cocoa butter but more sugar, and the mouthfeel is entirely different. The chocolate with less cocoa butter, those cocoa molecules aren't going to flow a lot. They're going to sort of stick and rub around in your taste buds, and you're going to get a really big, intense, very dark tasting flavor. But the chocolate with the same amount of cocoa solid but more cocoa butter is going to taste a lot lighter and brighter. It's going to flow more, and it's going to develop very differently. So very often when people are talking about a chocolate that tastes dark, the percentage has less to do, the percentage of total cacao has less to do with the actual flavor than many other things. And a very good example of that is Demori has a really beautiful chocolate they released called their IL100. It's not a creamier, but it's just a cacao mass that is high in cocoa butter, no bitterness, and flows through your mouth very cleanly, and it makes it taste like a chocolate that's not particularly dark. But it's got a beautiful flavor, and you definitely taste the beans they're using. If you did that without the cocoa butter, and there's certainly, I have a Picari version that's low in cocoa butter, same thing. It's a very different taste. That one tastes very big and intense. And I have uses for both of those, and I use them for very different things. But they definitely are different aspects. So when you're thinking about cocoa butter, I think you have to think about a lot of different things. It is part of the chocolate. But you get very different behaviors and very different uses and very different experiences. So when people are often, there's a trend to want chocolate that tastes very dark. And I get that sometimes too. And I want that sometimes too. But tasting dark really can have a lot to do with the cocoa butter percentage in a chocolate more than almost anything else, very frequently.
Mm-hmm. And I've also found, sorry.
Oh, I was going to ask for Carlos's comment on that, but I'll let you continue if you like.
No, please, Carlos.
Well, I pretty much agree with everything you said.
So I found that these lower cocoa butter percentage chocolates, they seem to have a slightly denser, crunchier, crisper texture. That really comes from this higher percentage of the solids, of the cocoa solids and the sugar. Now, Carlos, for your lower cocoa butter percentage chocolates, how would you describe them? How would you characterize them?
Can I jump in a sec before Carlos jumps in on that?
Yeah, of course.
I really agree with you, Sarah, because if a chocolate is tempered well, if it's low cocoa butter, it's going to be almost a little bit mushy. I don't want to use mushy. That's not a good word. It's going to be softer because the cocoa butter is what gives it, when you temper that and create that crystalline structure, that's where that snap and that crispness comes from. Pure cocoa butter is going to have a beautiful snap and a very good crispness, where a chocolate with very little is not going to have that at all. And that's why it behaves very differently in your mouth. So, we were talking earlier, Carlos mentioned all of our favorites, which is Steve DeVries's, probably Costa Rican bars that I'm not sure he's even making anymore. No added cocoa butter, beautiful flavor, but it definitely was a slightly softer. It didn't have that incredible snap. I'll look at quite a bit. So it's really, I think, a little bit more than what you were saying. But now I will get out of the way and let Carlos talk.
Yeah.
Actually, while you're talking about it, one of the ways I think I could have described it also is almost like a sponge while it's cleaning your mouth when you're eating chocolates that have lower cocoa butter percentage.
Yes, I agree with that.
It could be that, yes. Also, but there's also going to be more grit that you're going to feel in the chocolate as well, because the lower butter percentage will make your tongue come in contact with the solids almost immediately, And so that is one of the things that will definitely happen. As far as snap and density, I don't know, because since the only chocolate that I make that doesn't have an added butter is a 70%, and Guatemalan cacao has such a high fat content that sometimes I even feel that it doesn't make much difference if I added it or not.
Would you say that that's 55% is about as high as a typical cocoa bean gets to in terms of butter?
I would say so. Yes, it's 55% is definitely pretty much the record. I mean, there may be something higher, but it's the standard of the industry for sure.
Okay. And Carlos, looking back at your experience, what would be some advices that you would give chocolate makers on the benefits and maybe the challenges of adding the production of cocoa butter to their chocolate making process?
Well, absolutely. If they can find a way to do it that doesn't break the bank, that is the important part. If they don't go broke finding a way doing it, I'm all for it, because it's really going to add a lot to their chocolate, especially if they're doing origin-specific chocolates. That is extremely important. But again, the challenge, the big main challenge, and I'm sure a few people are addressing it because I've spoken to a few equipment makers about it, is finding the right equipment for it. In other words, you need the perfect press, and that is very expensive. I don't think that you'll be able to find something for less than $25,000 or $30,000. So it becomes an expensive piece of equipment that you need to buy. It'll be probably by far the most expensive piece of equipment a craft chocolate maker has to buy. Those are clear large challenges. And then the other one is simply finding it. I think that you have to go on like a pilgrimage to China and Korea and go to all the hydraulic press makers that are making hydraulic presses and see which one of them could come up with the perfect cocoa butter press. But I don't think it's something that you can just go on Alibaba and find.
A lot to consider. And Rich, how about you? Since you work with so many different types of chocolate with varying percentages of cocoa butter, can you give other chocolatiers like yourself advices in using different cocoa butter percentage in their recipe development?
Yeah, I mean, I would say first it always comes down to taste and mouthfeel. You taste your chocolates and you get a sense for how a chocolate behaves. And then once you do that, it depends on the piece you want to make. If you want to make a piece with a huge, big, explosive flavor up front that's just going to make your eyes open up, then a low cocoa butter chocolate in the ganache or the gianduja or whatever you're making for the center is a really good way to go, because that's what it's going to give you. It's going to give you that big, intense upfront flavor. If you want a piece that's a long-term complexity that you might change flavor several times over a few minutes, then you really want to go with a chocolate with a lot of cocoa butter in it, because it's going to give you that characteristic. I would almost always recommend for molding and that sort of work, going with a couverture chocolate. It's just much easier. But that's what you like.
Well, I want to hear a little bit from the two of you. Maybe a suggestion on 3 or 4 chocolates that you think would make a great comparison for anybody at home or at work who wants to try different chocolates and see how they behave in terms of cocoa butter percentages and differences.
You want to start it, Carlos?
Go ahead, Rich.
Okay. Sort of a few chocolates that give a good cross-section. I was playing last year with some of Dandelion's chocolates out of the west coast of the U.S., and they definitely don't add cocoa butter. And you can get some really big, their Papo chocolate was a lot of fun because it had just this sort of big, roasty, tangy flavor to it. And it was an interesting chocolate to work with. On the far end of the spectrum, I'm very fond of Alan McClure's chocolates from Patrick Chocolate. He does definitely add cocoa butter, but he can also bring out flavors from chocolates that are just intense and beautiful and very, very clean. It's almost like listening to an oboe versus a flute, you know, where the dandelion chocolate is kind of more of an oboe. It's a wider flavor, a wider character, and you know the Patrick chocolate is a very narrow, bright character, and you get very different things from them. And Alan's for the Patrick chocolate's a good example would be either his Madagascar, which is very, very, very intensely bright, or his Peruvian Pura, which I think is available from one place out on the West Coast, Chocolate Garage. I have it to work with, but we can't sell it as bars, so we can only work with it. And I think those are some nice. Also, as I mentioned, I like on the European side. I think you know Francois Pralou and Demori both add cocoa butter and do a very nice job. And Carlos Adiz earlier mentioned Maru chocolates out of Vietnam, which a couple of theirs are really, really beautiful. They do not add cocoa butter, but I think that their beans are pretty high in fat because they still get a really nice snap and a flavor development out of them. As opposed to the dandelion beans and madre beans and some of the others I've tasted, much lower in fat, I think, where it's a much more dense and intense flavor.
Okay, thank you. How about you, Carlos?
Well, yeah. Again, I would go to, if you're able to find a Steve DeVries bar, any Steve DeVries bar, you will be able to taste what a pure chocolate is. If you're able to find one of my bars, you will be able to taste. If any one of my 70% bars, you will able to very well taste the non-added butter. And if you buy one of my bars as well, in the either lower or higher percentages, they're a good example of what an added cocoa butter chocolate is. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of it available in the U.S. Rich knows where.
Well, I'm not saying that's our place.
Yeah, and but soon enough there will be more. Then again, Maru is a great suggestion. If you can get a hold of Freeze Home from Denmark, is a fantastic chocolate from another guy like us that's a reformed nerd and. Somebody that changed professions and went into chocolate making late in life, and Mikkel is a real character, and he makes phenomenal chocolate. Another guy that doesn't add cocoa butter, and again, Demori for the added butter is a great example. And if you can get a hold of a new maker that I've just come across from Hungary called Rosa Volgi. They've got some criollos that are incredible, and they're not adding any cocoa butter.
Oh, you mentioned Steve DeVries. I do want to throw in, Robbie Stout over at Ritual is still using a lot of Steve's equipment and working with Steve and making some very nice, no added cocoa butter chocolate from kind of the lineage of Steve's world.
All right. Well, thank you. I'll sure try it and compare them at home. So I want to close with a thank you to Richard Tango-Lowy from Dancing Lion Chocolate in New Hampshire, and Carlos Eichenberger, chocolate maker at Danta Chocolate in Guatemala, for taking time out of your busy day to join in on this conversation and to help educate us about cocoa butter and the importance that it really has in fine chocolate. And thanks for watching, and to access a copy of this video later on, please go to www.ecolechocolat.com. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much for having us.